Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about slander and a very specific form of slander. Slander is a very harmful crime in which you let others do the actual crime, but you make them do it. You don't have to dirty your own hands. So you warn the people against one particular individual, some dissident. You say that he's dangerous, and then you will find that all the shopkeepers, all the employers and so on start to do your bidding, because they entirely go by reputation. And so even if 100 people have nothing to say against you, and one person does, then to reputation-conscious people, that means a whole lot, and they will take that into account. So if you are not in the good books of the slanderers, you will find yourself vetoed and boycotted on a large scale, because the bourgeoisie is safely in the pockets of the slanderers. For example, the whole decades-long slander against the Hindu movement has implied that many leftist students and academics have now risen up in arms against any possible pro-Hindu speaker in their institutions. I say this on the occasion of very recent news that in Oxford, a few academics of Indian origin and a lot of students have ventured to boycott the talk by an advocate for Hindu causes, namely Rajiv Malhotra. Successfully at that, successfully in the sense that within their institution they pulled it off, except that the organizers found another location, a better location in fact, outside the university where the event could take place anyway. But okay, you see, this is one example of something that regularly happens. It has happened to me with several events called off under pressure from such anti-Hindu activists. I entirely sympathize with Hindu speakers in such situations, including Rajiv Malhotra. However, there is one single point I would like to dissent from. Those Hindu academics who play the anti-Hindu game are often described as sepoys. As you know, a sipahi is a soldier, and in the English spelling and pronunciation, sepoy, it specifically means those Indian-born soldiers who took service in the British Army, who were mercenaries against their own people. And so to that, these Indian academics are likened. Now, personally, I think that that is anachronistic. The idea that anti-Hindu activists in India or of Indian origin are doing the bidding of outside forces, just like the sepoy soldiers 200 years ago worked in the service of the East India Company. You see, right now, the outside world is not very interested in India. Maybe Indians like to flatter themselves that, oh, the whole world has it in for India. Well, I can tell you, as an outsider, that the whole world is just not interested in India. When they think of the outside world, on the one hand, they think of the Muslim world as a source of trouble, and on the other, they think of China as a mighty competitor. But India doesn't figure much in their imagination, though they have vaguely registered the fact that India is nowadays quite successful economically. They have also heard of this Hindu movement, and in the 90s they tended to swallow the Indian talk that this was some kind of a fascist movement, but then nothing happened in this fascist sense. For example, in 1996, the BJP briefly came to power for 13 days. Then it lost the vote of confidence with 1 vote. Now, Hitler in those circumstances would not have meekly stepped down, but that is what Atal Bihari Vajpayee for the BJP did. And he just abided his time. 2 years later, finally, he was really elected. But so, you see, the BJP simply plays the democratic game. And so all these warnings against the Hindu nationalists did not make such a big impression. People, if asked for their opinion, would say, yeah, I read in the paper that these are really harmful guys, but I don't know. And anyway, it is only when pressed for an opinion that they would say this. Actually, they had not much of an opinion. They didn't care so much. And vaguely, if they would really search their memory, they would remember, for example, that the biggest riot in post-independence India was that engineered against the Sikhs in 1984 by the Congress secularists. So if you really keep track of what happens in distant India, you would know that these secularists are as bad as the Hindus. Then there are, of course, the Muslims, about whom also not such a good opinion prevails. So more or less the idea was that, well, yeah, they're all barbarians, you know, don't bother me with it. So again, you see, no interest. And then nowadays they hear about Narendra Modi, this supposed bogey, supposedly guilty of the 2002 riots. And then he comes to power and he turns out to be a perfectly nice man. You see, America at one time refused him entry into the United States. Now, of course, he goes there, he's welcomed, he's addressed as a statesman, and he's respected not just by the NRIs in America, but also by the American government and business class. So, ultimately, you see, what Western opinion concerns about India, it is just sailing with the wind, seeing a little bit pragmatically how it goes. And so their opinion of Narendra Modi specifically is not that negative. Like, for instance, they heard that The Economist warned gravely on the eve of the elections against electing Modi. At the same time, they heard on the radio that the whole business community, judging by their behavior at the stock exchange, was very much in expectation of Modi coming to power to put an end to Congress socialism. Anyway, so the rest of the world has a pragmatic way of dealing with India, is not so concerned. And so it doesn't bother to hire sepoys in India. You see, what is happening nowadays is that the tables have turned. You see, the leading dance partner, so to speak, is the Indian secularists. And so Western academics, Western Indologists, which is a very, very small community, the only one that really has an interest in India, they follow the lead given by the Indian secularists. So they have certain contacts in India that arrange for them their lecture tours in India. You know, money-wise it doesn't mean much, but it gives prestige, you know, it's welcome. And so they stay friends with their secularist contacts in India, who in turn try to act as Western as possible. They meet one another on the cocktail circuit, and so it's all very superficial and very chummy. And, you know, when pressed for an opinion on India, they follow the leading secularist opinion emanating from India itself. And so I am very sure that the British Indians who acted against Hinduism and against Hindu speakers in Oxford, that they were not following a lead given by some Western conspiracy, that they were very much acting out Indian politics, and namely the Indian secularist veto against pro-Hindu voices. You see, I hear a lot the word decolonization in India, and I may say I have myself contributed to it. My doctoral thesis was called Decolonizing the Hindu Mind. And so, yes, there is some decolonization going on. Hindus still look up to Western models to some extent. Hindus do. I don't say Indians do. You see, India is not colonized. India has been decolonized in 1947, which is a very long time ago, a whole human lifetime ago. Practically nobody now alive has any memory of the colonial period. So India is not colonized. If there is anything that you can connect with the British and that you don't like, then it is Indians who have chosen to keep it. And we don't need to look far. The language that I am now speaking, English, why is it still in India? Not because the British imposed it, not because the Americans exert pressure for it, simply because a certain Indian Nehruvian elite has decided to keep it. The Constituent Assembly decided unanimously that English should be phased out. They put this in the Constitution. English would be phased out by 1965. And then they had a vote between should Hindi and Sanskrit, which is going to be the national language. And so one of these two should become the effective national language by 1965. Well, the Nehruvian elite, making use of the Dravidianist agitation against Hindi, managed to impose English indefinitely on India. Now, that is not the doing of the British, that is the doing of Indians. So this whole talk of decolonization is a bit suspect. It is far better to face your own responsibility. Indians have their own destiny in their hands. Now, what then is the use of Westerners in the campaign against Hinduism waged by the Indian secularists? You see, Indian agitators sometimes make good use of Western guides, of Western experts. And so in the campaign against Hinduism, there are a number of things that they let do by Westerners that Indians mostly are not equipped to do. They employ people like Wendy Doniger, like Sheldon Pollock. And, you know, talking of Sheldon Pollock, he is particularly useful to develop the discourse that not just Hindutva as a political movement, but Hinduism as such is very intimately linked with National Socialism. Now, Indians don't know much about National Socialism, about World War II history, and in fact, I think that is to their credit. Westerners, particularly Americans, tend to be a bit obsessed with it, to reduce everything to World War II memories. For example, when they wanted to justify the war against Serbia in 1999, they said, yeah, Milosevic is the new Hitler, and anybody who is against this war, he has the Munich spirit. Munich being an occasion when the Western powers try to make peace with Hitler. And similarly, when they wanted to invade Iraq, they said, but Saddam Hussein is the new Hitler, and anyone who opposes our invasion, he has the Munich spirit. So, you see, in India, World War II references are all-purpose. And so in this case, too, if you want to blacken the Hindu movement, it comes in very handy when you can liken it to National Socialism. Now, for that, it is useful to have a Western voice. First of all, Western voices are still somewhat authoritative in India. Secondly, they happen to know a lot about particular subjects like this one. So the anti-Nazi discourse as applied to Hindutva is a very particular slander technique, in which Westerners are employed, but which ultimately is guided by certain Indian forces. In fact, they pretty much have to use Westerners in this case, because in India itself, this obsession with World War II and with National Socialism is hardly there. Now, this has to do with India's particular experience of World War II. You see, India was relatively far from the main theaters of war. It took part distantly with about 3 million local native soldiers in the service of the British war effort, with both the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha recruiting for this war effort. But then with Subhash Chandra Bose, who just as much as Savarkar was a freedom fighter, siding with the Axis powers. So already the participation of India in the Second World War was more diversified than that of Germany or Japan or America or England. Then, you had some old figures, like in India you had Judge Radha Vinod Pal, who during the Tokyo trial was very favorable to the Japanese accused rather than to the Americans sitting in judgment upon them. You had, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi, who wrote letters to Hitler pleading with him, calling him his friend, and pleading with him to desist from continuing the war. So the Indian approach to the Second World War was much more diversified. Also, at the end of the war, people became more and more aware of what Subhash Chandra Bose had done fighting on the Japanese side. Subhash Bose himself died in the war, probably, that's at least what we've been told. But his lieutenants were brought to trial, to stand trial in India. Now, at that point, those who had opposed Subhash Bose, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, offered to be their lawyers in court. And so this was a demonstration of national unity. Indians said, okay, you see, some people were on the side of the British, some were on the side of the Japanese, some changed their minds halfway, like Congress did, like Gandhi did. But anyway, all of us, we had the best interests of India in mind, and that is what counts. In fact, in a few cases, this was flattered. Like the communists did not have the best interests of India in mind. But then, precisely by being a bit flattered, even a bit mendacious, it shows the enormous determination of everyone in India to put this conflict behind them and to rally around India. So, in India, on 15 August 1945, the Second World War was really over. Whereas in Europe, in America, it has essentially continued. That war psychology is still there. Oh, and another factor I really should mention is the figure of Churchill. In the rest of the world, Churchill is lionized, is glorified as the man who stood against National Socialism. Now, in India, they have a very different opinion about Churchill. Churchill is the political responsible for the Bengal famine that killed 3 million people. And he had the freedom and the chance to prevent this famine, but he didn't. He chose not to do it. Not so much because he per se wanted to kill Indians, but because he just didn't think Indians important enough. Oh, and then another little detail I could mention. The national anthem, Jana Gana Mana, was composed in India in 1911, but for the very first time it was used as national anthem by Subhash Chandra Bose's soldiers fighting in Germany. It was in Hamburg in 1942 that this was used as anthem for the very first time. So you see, if you would want to now live out your obsession with National Socialism, you could make a really great case against India itself. I don't mean the Hindutva movement, I mean India itself. Like, for instance, you could use the fact that Subhash Chandra Bose is still lionized in India till today. You know, you have Netaji Airport, Netaji Stadium, many things, many boulevards and so on are named after him. And so India has never felt any guilt about this, never felt any need to undo anything that refers to Netaji. Okay, so this National Socialism discourse is applied specifically to the Hindutva movement. And so it is routinely said in secularist sources, yeah, they are the Indian equivalent of National Socialism, and if given half a chance, they will do what Hitler did. In fact, the area where I meet this kind of discourse most is in discussions about the Aryan invasion theory. So it is claimed, yeah, all this talk of an Indian homeland, that is really Nazi. Well, that is really very rich. Because the Nazis, of course, did not believe that India was the homeland. On the contrary, they very much believed in the Aryan invasion theory. To them, the Aryan invasion theory was the paradigm of their own worldview. You see, what does the Aryan invasion theory say? First of all, these Europeans invade in India. Of course, the Nazis said, the Europeans are naturally dynamic, so it is they who invade in the country of these indolent, dark people rather than the other way around. Then you see they are very concerned about their race. That's why they institute the caste system. In India, there are still movements still today that keep on applying this theory. However, because of natural human urges, they did mix occasionally with native women, and so gradually their blood was diluted, and they became a bit halfway, a bit European, a bit native, and so they lost their superiority to some extent. That's why the Indians are a bit backward compared to the Europeans, or so European racists said. But fortunately for them, they have been colonized by the British, who are Germanic people, who are pure Aryans, who are superior. So the best thing that could happen for India is to remain safely under the guidance of the British. So it is not true, as many people in India thought, that Hitler was sympathetic to the Indian freedom struggle. He told Subhash Chandra Bose to his face, what do you need freedom for? You have the best chance in the world of being under the British. And we are willing to support the British Empire, to give them manpower, to give them technology, because we think it is great. We think it is good that these dark natives are under the domination of superior Aryans. What the British do in India, we are going to do in Russia, to dominate these people. And so the Aryan invasion theory was therefore a real illustration of the Nazi worldview. Now, still you see the secularists could say, yeah, but the idea at least of claiming the homeland for yourself, isn't that a bit National Socialist? Well, no, the Nazis did not claim Germany as the homeland. They were satisfied that it was somewhere in Europe, that it was at any rate not in a backward place like India. All right. Then another thing they say is, well, there have been contacts with the Nazis. Well, there have hardly been any contacts, among other reasons, simply because at that time distances were still very big. The news about what happened in Europe was very limited and filtered by the British. So that, is not much the case. What is the case is that B.S. Munjee, a leader of the Hindu Mahasabha, took a tour around Europe, and among other things, he visited the Italian youth brigades of Mussolini's fascist regime. Now, the secularists will say, and that is on which the RSS drills are based. Well, you see, that is a simple anachronism. The RSS already existed. It already had its uniform. It already had its drills. So Munjee may have been interested in what happened, but it made no difference to anything happening in India. At one point also, it seems, though it is hard to document, that Hedgewar spoke favorably about these upcoming authoritarian regimes in Europe. That is not entirely impossible. I will not take the trouble to deny that. Let's assume it is true. Well, you see, a number of British political leaders, including Winston Churchill, have equally spoken in favor of these authoritarian regimes. Churchill thought that democracy required a certain level of civilization, so he thought democracy was good for England, but not good for Italy. You see, looking at it from India, you might say, yeah, Italy is also Europe, that's part of the superior Europeans. Well, in those days, they were a bit more precise than that. They thought Northern Europeans are superior, Southern Europeans are already a bit African, so the Italians are not fit for democracy. For them, it is good to have a strong leader. So, long live Mussolini, that is what Churchill said. About Hitler also, he said, well, you see, if I were a German, I would be very happy with a leader like Hitler. And indeed, many historians have said, if Hitler had died in 1937, his name would have been made. And now, all across Germany and the rest of the world, you would have Hitler boulevards and Hitler stadiums and so on. It is because he ended up in the war that his name was very, very seriously tarnished. So, you see, if any Hindu was enthusiastic at any time about Hitler, he was not exceptional. In fact, many leftist leaders also were, like the young Fidel Castro, for example, describes in his diary how he imitated the speeches by Mussolini, and so on, and so on. So the authoritarian powers were quite popular at the time, on the same footing as the Soviet Union. You see, at that time, in the 30s, they thought that the Western colonial democracies, Britain and France especially, they were old style. You see, they were past their prime, they had no future, they were in problems, they had economic crisis and so on. And the future was with these authoritarian states, just as much Nazi Germany as the Soviet Union. Indeed, Subhas Chandra Bose at that time said that what India needs is an authoritarian regime which takes the best from National Socialism and from communism. See, one smiles to read this now, but that was the thinking at that time. So I do not exclude that some people in the Hindutva movement thought likewise. Again, that has no effect on the actual Hindu movement, which already existed, which didn't change under the impact of the then popular authoritarian regimes, and which today has practically no memory of that period anyway. Because that's, of course, another thing you see in the anachronistic secularist discourse, that they try to apply some things they have found out or that they claim about Hindutva in its beginning years, and apply that to the BJP functioning today. So they pick out a quote from Golwalkar in the 1930s, saying that the minorities in India should not have voting rights. That's exactly what he said. And that therefore this is the BJP policy today. Well, the BJP policy has nothing to do with Golwalkar in the 30s or with Savarkar in the 20s. It has greatly evolved, and to deny that simply says something about the secularists, about their anachronism, about their poor intellectual equipment to deal with realities as they are today. So at that time, the opposition against democracy was very popular. Today it is not. You see, that's one reason, for example, why there is this anachronism, or why it is anachronistic. A large part of BJP thinking is simply following existing trends, is riding with the tide. So today, the rejection of democracy is out. We have seen the collapse of the fascist regimes. We have seen the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so now the rejection of democracy is not popular anymore. So the BJP that just follows suit is not talking about any problem of democracy anymore. Then BJP calls itself nationalist. Now it so happens that in reading from the West about nationalism in India, that leaves a bad taste in the mouth, because in the West, nationalism now is a negative category. In the interwar years, it was different. You not only had fascism and communism and so on, and not communism, they call themselves internationalists, but you see National Socialism, they call themselves nationalists. So and it was after the First World War, when everybody was imitating troops on the way to the front line. So you had all these processions by sporting groups, by brass bands and so on, in uniform, in military style. You see, that was the habit at that time. And so that has gone out. In the West, that is now a foreign country, so to speak. And so nationalism is frowned upon. Now, in India, it is not the case. Most people, both Congress and the BJP, call themselves nationalists. Only the Congress call themselves secular nationalists, and the BJP call themselves genuinely secular nationalists. See, the BJP, it was long ago that they called themselves Hindu. They carefully don't call themselves Hindu anymore. But they say that they too are secularist, except that they are a bit more genuinely secularist than Congress is. Now, that nationalism mainly means that they want to keep India together, which I think is a perfectly valid thing to strive for. I don't think it should be obligatory. But nevertheless, I think it is a good point. Personally, too, I wish that India stays together, and that, for example, Kashmir stays with India. Even though I am, of course, aware, contrary to some RSS leading lights, that India has been politically fragmented for most of its history. But then in those days, you could keep a culture together even though it was politically fragmented, because politics was not very important. You had a king conquering a certain country, levying taxes there, and otherwise not concerned. And so he used his taxes to pay his army, and that was mainly it. And so, if there was a street through the center of the village, that is because the local people had laid it. It was not because the king had interfered and said, hey, we need a street here. And so in those days, the presence of the state, no matter how democratic or no matter how authoritarian, was very limited. Whereas today, even the most democratic state has far more say in the lives of ordinary people than at any time in history. That is why today states are relatively important, and today the political unity of India is desirable. So I think it's good to keep that together. Congress says it wants to, though it supports policies and groups that actually want something else. And the BJP also says it wants to keep India together. Well, there is nothing wrong with that. And so if the Nazis and the fascists said something similar, that in itself is not why we abhor their names. However, those countries were also imperialistic. Not that this was so exceptional. The colonial democracies were also imperialistic. But nevertheless, it is undesirable that, for example, Italy tried to conquer Ethiopia or Albania, that Germany tried to conquer and effectively conquer Czechoslovakia or Poland. That is not desirable at all, but then that is not what the Hindu movement has ever done. There is a lot of hullabaloo in secularist circles about the map of India used by the RSS, which is a colonial age map in which Burma forms part of India. Now, that is not at all a claim on Burmese territory. That's just historical. At that time, British India comprised Burma. So that is simply the typical RSS attitude of piety for the ancestors. So a map instituted by Hedgewar is not going to be changed by the RSS. Indeed, in that respect too, the RSS does not live up to its image, to its very artificially created image of somehow being a national socialist movement. Scholars have summarized the Nazi ideology in terms of three denials, three negatives. Namely, fascist movements were anti-conservative, anti-liberal or anti-democratic, and anti-communist. Anti-conservatism, this might surprise you, but if you read the National Socialist literature, you see that it is very pertinent. You see, conservatives were deemed the old school, the old style, the old colonial democracies, for example. It was the church, it was anything that modern people abhorred. And so the fascist leaders were typically men of action in their 30s. Just old enough to look up to for youngsters, but not older than that. And so they abhorred the old fogies. And so the RSS is already very different from that attitude. They have the traditional Indian respect for elders. That is why structurally the RSS is very gerontocratic. They have old men at the helm, often somewhat senile men who don't know exactly anymore what is happening, but who are honored and who are therefore given top positions. So that may not all be good, what the RSS is doing there, but at any rate, it is the very opposite of fascist. As for anti-liberal, you see, the fascists were against much of what we nowadays call Americanization. And against that, they were for local identities, for traditional mores, traditional practices. When you look at the BJP behavior now that it's in power, you see that it is very much on the side of Americanization. It has opened the borders for foreign media ownership, for multinational companies and so on. Again, I do not say that it is desirable, but it is not National Socialist. As for anti-communism, the RSS was never seriously anti-communist. They never studied communist ideology. All that they vaguely knew was that the communists in India are not loyal to India. Like, for instance, they favored the partition. And so they reduced it to that. You see, communists are pro-foreign, are pro-Soviet, pro-Chinese. And otherwise, it wasn't deeper than that. In fact, maybe that is not so much a Hindutva trait, that may well be a pan-Indian trait. Because on the secularist side, you have the same thing. Like, I am reminded of some secularist article pleading that Pol Pot was a Buddhist. You see, the writer tried to kill two birds with one stone. He wanted to argue that, you see, communism is not that bad. You know, he talked about Pol Pot tyranny, as if Pol Pot hadn't been motivated by communism, as if this was a personal idiosyncrasy of him. At the same time, they wanted to argue, oh, all religions are the same thing. Don't say that there is anything wrong with Islam, because look, Buddhism is no better. Look at Pol Pot. In fact, I don't think there's anyone in history who has killed more Buddhist monks and destroyed more Buddhist temples and monasteries than Pol Pot. So that attitude is common among the always ever studiously superficial secularists, but equally in the Hindutva movement. You see, they never made a proper analysis of the communist problem. So they were only anti-communist in a very superficial sense. So on all three counts, they were just not up to the mark of being somehow India's own version of fascism. Finally, I would like to remind the foreign India watchers who are in league with the Indian secularists that in the 90s, when the BJP was rising in power and threatening to form the government, that they had all predicted terrible things for when the BJP would come to power. They would come down on Dalits and they would come down on women, because there is this totally imaginary talk that Hindutva is against women, is pro-caste, against the low caste, and so on. And so, you know, my favorite among their predictions, and I've heard it quite a number of times, is that they're going to open gas chambers for the Muslims, and they're going to throw all Muslims, all 100 million or so of them, into the Indian Ocean. Well, I don't know, the BJP has been in power already several times, and I haven't noticed this. And so a good scientific theory predicts, and by that criterion, what those India watchers are doing is something very different from good science. Thank you.